Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail into the unknown, back to the 15th century, when the world was full of mystery and explorers were out to map uncharted lands. You stand at the edge of ship, the salty breeze against your face, a small compass guiding the way, and ahead, the great unknown. The age of exploration is dawning, and these explorers aren't just looking for new lands. They're looking for gold, for spice, for everything they've never had, but always wanted. But here's the kicker. You probably wouldn't survive this. The journey is treacherous, the unknown is full of danger, and more often than not, these early explorers didn't have any clue what they were getting into. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, post where you're tuning in from, and let me know the local time. It's always fun to know where this history is echoing across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself aboard one of the ships that set out to change the world forever, an unassuming vessel packed with eager men whose minds are as open as the sea before them. What do they see when they looked ahead? Adventure? Gold? The answer, of course, was all of the above, but it wasn't just about finding new lands. It was about trade and power and the ability to reshape the world's economy in ways never seen before. The spice trade, the Silk Road, and the riches of the Far East were all hanging in the balance. But there's something else going on that you may not know about, something that seems so bizarre today that it almost seems like a joke. You see, as much as they were looking for gold, these explorers were also looking to trade something else: women. Historians still argue whether the trading of women in these early exploration days was more out of necessity or pure desire. Was it a matter of forging alliances, or were the women seen as commodities, just another part of the trade? The idea seems ludicrous to us today, but in the context of the time, it was simply one more piece of the puzzle. With the promise of silk, spices, and rum, what else could these explorers want more than the kind of currency that had yet to be fully explored? Perhaps this doesn't sound as romantic as you'd expect from a history lesson about explorers. But let's pause for a moment and see what happens when desire, trade, and exploration collide in the most unexpected ways. Imagine you're on board one of those ships heading for the New World. What would you have traded for? Gold, sure, but what if you were offered something equally valuable, but far less tangible? A wife or a woman who could secure an alliance between explorers and indigenous tribes. Yes, you heard that right. Trading wives for goods like rum, silk, and even land. The dynamics of these exchanges were fascinating, and the practice of trading women was as much a part of the economy as any precious metal or exotic goods. You're witnessing history unfolding, where human beings were exchanged just as readily as items from foreign lands. Now picture this. You're a European explorer making contact with indigenous peoples on distant shores. You have a bounty of goods from Europe: rum, blankets, iron tools, and of course silk. And you're not just exchanging these for food or shelter, but for something far more valuable, at least in the eyes of the explorers: women. The concept is almost unfathomable today, but back then, the practice was common and often seen as a practical solution to building alliances, securing trust, or even gaining prestige in the eyes of other European competitors. It sounds like a wild idea, but remember that European explorers were also entering a world where the power structures were different. Indigenous tribes had their own systems of trade, their own ways of negotiating alliances and resolving conflicts. Women in these societies often held different roles compared to their European counterparts. They were not simply wives or daughters, but sometimes warriors, leaders, and decision-makers. In this context, the trading of women became a complex exchange of not just goods, but power, land, and influence. In fact, some historians still argue whether these exchanges were based on mutual respect or if they were just the harsh reality of the times. One in which European explorers used what they had to make the best of their situation, even if that meant leveraging human lives. In exchange for women, explorers could gain land or access to resources that were crucial for their survival and expansion of empire. But the question remains: Did the women involved in these trades see it as a choice or a necessity? Were they truly traded, or was it a complex cultural negotiation? It's hard to say, but it's a reminder that history, especially when it comes to exploration, is rarely as simple as it seems. But let's not get lost in the complexities just yet. Imagine yourself as a European explorer in the 15th century. You've made it across treacherous seas, battling storms and hunger, and finally, you land on what seems like fertile ground. The locals are friendly, or perhaps not, but you're able to establish some kind of rapport. And suddenly, in exchange for some rum, a few silk garments, and perhaps a chest of nails, you're offered something unexpected: a woman. This isn't a bizarre twist in the plot of some movie. It's a reality of early global trade. You can almost smell the salt water in the air, the intoxicating aroma of rum, and the uncertainty of the situation. It wasn't just about commerce. It was about establishing dominance, and women, in some cultures, were key to those negotiations. Now, imagine the shock of the indigenous women involved. They were possibly given as gifts, but did they see themselves as part of a transaction? Were they seen as valuable assets in the trade of resources, alliances, and land? In a world of early exploration, where survival was a daily struggle, where power was measured by access to goods and people, women were often caught in the web of these exchanges. It's a stark reminder of how power, gender, and economics often intersected in ways that are still debated today. As you stand on the deck, the sun dips below the horizon, casting a golden light over the ocean. You feel the ship rocking gently as you take in the sights and sounds of the bustling port. Sailors hurry about, unloading cargo from the ships, while traders shout prices and negotiate deals. It's a scene of vibrant, chaotic energy, but underneath it all, there's an undercurrent of something darker: the trade of women, which has quietly been woven into the very fabric of these early encounters. As absurd as it may sound, you can't help but wonder how this became an accepted part of the exchange. The exchange of women for goods like rum and silk wasn't isolated to one place or group. It was a widespread practice. Explorers had their eyes on more than just land. They sought power, alliances, and influence in any form they could find. And for many European explorers, that meant trading not just trinkets and spices, but people. This wasn't a mere exchange of women. It was part of a larger system of barter where women were often seen as the currency of peace, trade, or social standing. Let's pause and imagine how strange this must have seemed to the indigenous people. You're standing in the shoes of a tribal leader, meeting Europeans for the first time. You've heard rumors of these strange people who come from distant lands with shiny objects and strange ways. But now, faced with them face to face, the situation takes an unexpected turn. The European explorers are offering something so precious and yet so utterly strange: rum, silk, and sometimes promises of power in exchange for something that isn't theirs to give. The trade of women wasn't just about acquiring new allies or material goods. For some cultures, women played significant roles in diplomacy and warfare. Taking them away could cripple a tribe's power structure. The explorers didn't just take something. They were extracting a fundamental piece of the social fabric that held these communities together. Historians still argue whether this was seen as a mutual agreement or simply a brutal trade of power. Some believe that these early transactions were one-sided, where indigenous peoples were at a severe disadvantage, trading valuable members of their society for foreign luxuries. Others suggest there was a more complex cultural exchange, with women being given for reasons beyond trade, sometimes as part of marriage agreements, peace offerings, or even political alliances. Whatever the reason, the impact was the same. The first explorers to arrive on these distant shores brought with them not just new technologies and goods, but also cultural practices that were completely foreign to the indigenous peoples. While this may sound like a strange episode in history, the truth is that this practice wasn't isolated. Even centuries later, during the colonial era, the exchange of women as part of trade continued, although it evolved over time. The stories of women traded for goods like rum or silk are still scattered across historical accounts, serving as unsettling reminders of the power dynamics at play during these early days of exploration. But what makes these early transactions even more bizarre is how this practice tied into the broader, almost surreal system of colonial economics that exploited everything: people, land, and even the most basic human relationships. Picture this. You're now deep in the trade routes of the Pacific, and silk and rum are prized commodities, easily exchanged for land and alliances. You can almost hear the clinking of coins, the rustling of silk, and the murmurs of whispered negotiations. But in this world, the true power lies not in the spices or the silk. It's in the control of human lives. A woman, whose value could never be measured in simple terms, became a piece in this grand, global chess game. The explorers, fueled by a sense of entitlement, viewed women in these societies as bargaining tools, their worth defined by their ability to secure peace, alliances, or simply leverage in an uncertain world. But where did this idea come from? How did the concept of trading human beings, specifically women, become so ingrained in early colonial trade? It all came down to how explorers and colonists viewed themselves in relation to the indigenous peoples they encountered. They saw themselves as civilized, and the indigenous peoples they encountered, whether in the Americas, Africa, or the Pacific, were often seen as uncivilized. This stark, racialized difference in thinking is what made it possible for Europeans to view the exchange of women as a simple, rational transaction. To them, the worth of the women they exchanged was often viewed through a lens of dominance, an extension of their control over the land and the resources they coveted. It's difficult to understand today, but back then, the explorers didn't just come to conquer. They came to trade. And trading women, in their minds, was no more strange than trading any other resource. Historians still debate whether this was a product of European exploitation or if it was simply a reflection of the economic systems that thrived during the age of exploration. What's clear, though, is that the practice of trading women was deeply embedded in the historical reality of the times, an exchange that occurred in plain sight, yet is often overlooked in the grand narratives of exploration and discovery. As you think about the complexities of these exchanges, consider the impact on the women involved. What must it have been like to be a part of that system? Were they coerced, or were they complicit in the exchange? Were some women treated as commodities, while others wielded their own power in negotiations, using their position to gain favor or safety for their communities? The stories of these women, often lost to time, are another part of the narrative that needs to be uncovered. Were their voices ever heard, or were they lost in the undercurrent of colonial history? The trade of women in early exploration is not just a side note in the history of trade. It's a reminder that even in the most well-meaning explorations, there are deeper, darker currents at play. As you continue your journey into the heart of this historical trade, remember that the actions of the explorers were not isolated. They reverberated across continents, influencing the lives of countless women who would never have a chance to tell their stories. You're standing in the center of a bustling port, the air thick with the smell of salt water and exotic spices, the sound of traders shouting over each other filling your ears. Around you, the exploration ships have returned with their goods. Exotic silks from the east, barrels of rum from the Caribbean, and chests of precious spices that the European aristocracy crave. But among these coveted treasures is something more troubling, more human. The practice of trading women as part of the very economy that sustains these voyages. It's a reality that feels both foreign and unsettling. But it's also an essential part of how these early explorers navigated the new territories they sought to conquer. The value of silk and rum was clear, but the true currency was often the power to command loyalty. And for that, women were seen as a vital piece of the puzzle. As you walk through the crowded streets, the significance of these exchanges begins to hit you. The concept of trading women was not as simple as it sounds. These exchanges were not just about bartering for goods. They were about establishing dominance and control. The women, in many cases, were part of diplomatic or marriage alliances, particularly between European explorers and indigenous tribes. The very idea of trading a person, especially a woman, for goods like silk or rum would seem unfathomable today. Yet, back then, it was often seen as part of a broader exchange that was necessary to secure peace, form alliances, or ensure survival in a new world. This practice is not without its controversies. Historians still debate the role these women played in the trade. Were they simply pawns in the imperialist game, traded to strengthen alliances, or were some of them able to assert some form of agency in these exchanges? It's likely that the answer is complex. Some women may have been willing participants, negotiating their own safety or the future of their communities in the process. Others were undoubtedly coerced into these trades, their autonomy taken away as their value was measured by the whims of explorers and colonizers who saw them as little more than resources to be exchanged for power. But let's step back for a moment and put ourselves in the shoes of the explorers. When they first arrived in these new lands, their understanding of the world was vastly different from what we know today. Many explorers saw the indigenous people as noble savages, a term that was used to describe those they perceived as being untarnished by the corrupting influence of civilization. These encounters, filled with curiosity and misunderstanding, were often portrayed in a romanticized light in European eyes. The truth, however, was much messier. The indigenous people saw these Europeans as both a threat and an opportunity. Some tribes saw the exchange of women as part of their cultural practices, not realizing that the Europeans were using it as a strategic move to secure their dominance over the land. It's a bizarre reality when you think about it. On one hand, you have explorers trying to establish their power in a new world, while on the other, you have indigenous people negotiating their own survival, using what resources they had to engage with these foreign invaders. Women then became the bridge between two completely different worlds, two cultures clashing, and sometimes merging under incredibly tense and violent circumstances. This exchange of women wasn't limited to the Americas either. As European exploration spread to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands, similar practices emerged. In places like the Pacific Islands, indigenous tribes would offer women as part of trade deals with Europeans, sometimes as a way to ensure access to European goods that were considered valuable. And let's not forget that the term wife was often used loosely in these exchanges. These women were not necessarily brides in the traditional sense, but were often part of power plays that allowed both sides to assert their control over the territory. The impact of these trades would last for generations, as European explorers built their empires on the backs of both indigenous labor and the resources that they acquired through such exchanges. But the effects were deeply damaging for the indigenous populations. Entire cultures were upended, families were torn apart, and women were traded like commodities, their worth measured in goods and alliances rather than their humanity. Now, let's think about how these early explorers viewed the women involved in these trades. In their minds, these women were just part of the equation, an exchangeable commodity, no different than the silks or spices they were after. But what was their perception of these women's worth? Historians still debate whether these women were fully aware of the economic and political implications of their involvement in these exchanges. Some may have seen it as a necessity, a way to ensure their tribe's survival, or to create alliances with the Europeans, who brought with them access to new tools and goods. Others, however, may have had little choice in the matter, their roles limited by the harsh realities of colonialism and exploration. You can almost feel the tension as these early traders set foot in unfamiliar lands, unsure of how to interact with the people they encountered. These women, whether traded or offered in exchange for goods, were often caught in the middle of these complex power plays. And while the European explorers may have seen this as a mere transaction, the women involved were caught between two worlds, each with its own expectations and definitions of worth. In many cases, their stories have been erased from history, lost in the noise of exploration and conquest. Their lives were subsumed into the broader narrative of imperialism, making it all the more important to bring them to light and examine the ways in which they were affected by these early encounters. In the end, The exchange of women was part of a much larger system of trade that was central to the age of exploration. These exchanges shaped the relationships between Europe and the indigenous world in ways that continue to influence how we think about power, gender, and colonialism today. As you stand back and take in this complex web of human interaction, you begin to see how the early days of exploration were not just about mapping new territories or acquiring gold, but about laying the foundations of a system that would reshape the world for centuries to come. You're walking through the heart of a bustling colonial port city. The air is thick with the scent of exotic goods and the rhythmic sounds of trade negotiations, the clang of metal, and the murmur of dozens of languages. It's here that a strange kind of commerce thrives, where goods like rum, silk, and spices exchange hands, but so do people. The trade of human lives, particularly women, is not just an unfortunate consequence of the age of exploration. It is woven into the very fabric of the emerging colonial economy. These trades may seem completely foreign to us, but in the context of the time, they were seen as just another form of transaction, a way to solidify power, create alliances, and build empires. As you stroll through the busy market, you start to notice a pattern. Alongside the valuable spices and shimmering silks that line the stalls, you see women, sometimes standing in the shadows, waiting for their role to unfold in the story of European imperialism. It's unsettling, but it's also part of a larger system that was rooted in the trade of everything, from goods to land to human lives. Women were traded not just for goods, but for power, influence, and survival. The very idea of trading a human being for material wealth is unsettling to us today. But back then, it was part of the brutal logic that governed the exploration and colonization of vast new territories. To understand how this practice became so deeply ingrained in European exploration, we need to dive into the power structures at play. Early explorers, driven by the thirst for wealth, sought out alliances that would provide them with access to valuable resources and territories. And what better way to establish an alliance than through the exchange of women, objects of perceived value, but also, in some cultures, vital elements of social and political systems. A woman's value, in many cases, was tied to her ability to secure peace, foster alliances, and cement relationships between different peoples. By offering women in trade, explorers were able to gain favor and trust, even if the women themselves had little say in the matter. Think about the indigenous women standing at the crossroads of two vastly different worlds. On the one side, you have the explorers, men who come from distant lands, bringing with them new diseases, new trade goods, and a promise of power. On the other, you have a system of indigenous societies, each with its own values and social structures. Women in these societies weren't always seen the same way as in European cultures. Some were warriors, some held positions of power, and some were seen as the lifeblood of the tribe, central to maintaining the balance of their people's culture and survival. And yet, here they are, caught in an exchange that reduces them to mere pawns in a game of diplomacy and conquest. This practice is more than just a transaction. It's a reflection of the power dynamics between the explorers and the indigenous populations. The explorers, with their guns and goods, were able to place themselves in positions of authority over the indigenous people. And in doing so, they made the trade of women seem almost normal, a mere part of the process of discovery. And in many cases, it worked. These exchanges led to treaties, peace agreements, and alliances that allowed European powers to secure their positions in foreign lands. But what cost? Historians still debate the nuances of these exchanges. Some view them as essential to the survival of indigenous groups who needed to deal with the newcomers in order to secure their own place in a rapidly changing world. Others argue that this practice was nothing short of exploitation, stripping away the agency of women and reducing them to items in a trade deal. Either way, what's clear is that the practice of trading women had far-reaching consequences. Not only did it affect the women involved, but it also reshaped entire societies, creating imbalances that would reverberate for centuries. These transactions weren't always as simple as the explorers offering goods in exchange for women. Sometimes, women were given as part of a larger diplomatic exchange, perhaps as a means of cementing an alliance or averting conflict. At times, these women were married off to explorers in the hope that it would create peace between two groups. But even in these marriages, the women's roles were seen as secondary to the larger political goals of the transaction. In many cases, women had little say in who they were married to or the lives they were expected to lead. Their identities were shaped by the decisions of men, explorers, tribal leaders, and colonists, who saw them as means to an end. As we reflect on this, think about the lasting impact of these early trades. The way women were treated during this time helped shape colonial attitudes towards women in the centuries that followed. The treatment of indigenous women was one aspect of a broader colonial system that viewed non-European people as lesser and their cultures as inferior. While these early explorers may have been in pursuit of riches, they were also in pursuit of power, and the exchange of women was one of the tools they used to achieve it. It is a sobering thought, but an important one when considering the legacies of colonialism. But let's look beyond the grim aspects for a moment. What can we learn from these early, often difficult exchanges? First, it's important to recognize that the stories of these women, often ignored or overlooked, are central to understanding the true impact of exploration. These women were not just victims of circumstance. They were active participants in a system that, for better or worse, shaped the course of history. Their stories are essential to understanding the broader history of exploration, trade, and colonization. Their resilience, their agency, and their voices, whether we hear them today or not, are part of the untold stories that make up the complex narrative of human history. As you ponder the complexities of these early encounters, the trade of women, and the far-reaching consequences of those transactions, remember that history is full of untold stories. And while we may never know all the details, what we do know is that the actions of these early explorers, no matter how bizarre or unsettling they seem, played a role in shaping the world we know today. As we continue our journey through these early exchanges, it becomes clear that the story of trade between explorers and indigenous peoples wasn't just about acquiring material goods. It was about shaping relationships, power, and society itself. The trade of women, as strange and unsettling as it might sound, was integral to these evolving dynamics. You're walking along a colonial outpost now, hearing the clatter of ships being unloaded as the latest batch of explorers comes ashore, bringing new goods, silk, rum, and tobacco, but also leaving behind the human toll of their missions. Some of these exchanges were merely part of a much larger system of diplomacy, but the more you learn, the more you realize how little was truly voluntary in these early days of exploration. The practice of trading women for goods like silk, rum, or even land wasn't isolated. It was intertwined with the broader imperialist goals of exploration. Explorers, in many ways, weren't just aiming to discover new lands or expand their empires. They were creating relationships that would ensure their hold over foreign territories. These relationships, built on trust and, in many cases, force, often involve the exchange of women, whether as gifts, wives, or tokens of alliance. And though this might seem like an uncomfortable reality, it was considered an accepted practice at the time. But let's stop for a moment and take a closer look at the reality of these relationships. On one side, you have European explorers armed with advanced technology, weapons, and the desire to carve out their piece of the world. On the other side, you have indigenous tribes who, while possessing their own advanced knowledge of the land, were often at a disadvantage when facing these unfamiliar invaders. And somewhere in the middle were the women, caught between two radically different worlds, their lives and fates often shaped by the actions and decisions of men who viewed them as bargaining chips. What makes this even more complex is that these exchanges weren't always about subjugation or exploitation, at least from the perspective of those involved. Historians still debate whether these women were always coerced into these roles, or if, in some cases, they played active parts in shaping the trade. Were some of these women willing participants, taking on the role of bargaining power to protect their communities or gain advantages for their people? It's possible, and yet the uncomfortable reality remains that women, especially indigenous women, had little to no control over their fates in these exchanges. In some instances, indigenous women were used as marriage pawns, traded for goods or land in a system that still echoes through history today. The practice was often viewed as a means to secure peace, create alliances, or even reinforce dominance over local populations. These marriages, though framed as alliances, were built on the same logic as trading commodities, designed to ensure that European settlers would dominate the new territories they had encountered. In return, the indigenous women were expected to integrate into European social structures, often abandoning their own traditions, cultures, and languages in favor of adapting to a foreign way of life. One interesting aspect of these exchanges is the idea of gift exchange, a concept that was used to solidify alliances. Historically, exchanging gifts was a central part of many indigenous cultures. However, when Europeans entered the scene, they redefined this tradition, transforming it into a transactional system where human lives, in the form of women, became part of the currency. This shift marked a dramatic change in how human beings were viewed in the global exchange system. What was once a cultural custom became part of the cold, impersonal transactions that defined European colonization. Take, for example, the Polynesian islands. When European explorers arrived, many indigenous tribes viewed the arrival of foreign goods as an opportunity for exchange. However, these exchanges often turned into exploitative practices, with women being traded for things like cloth, metal tools, or other European luxuries. These practices weren't just about survival for indigenous tribes. It was about maintaining their dignity, navigating the strange new world that was being thrust upon them. But for many, these exchanges were not freely chosen. They were the result of coercion, manipulated by the European explorers who were seeking power. On the other side, consider the European perspective. Women, both in Europe and the New World, were seen as symbols of domesticity and property. Women from European families were often used in colonial settings to cement relationships and legitimize land claims. But it wasn't only European women who were involved in these exchanges. Indigenous women were part of this system too. They weren't just tools for colonial domination. They were also pawns in the larger political maneuvering of the time. In the broader context of history, these exchanges mark a painful period of dislocation for women, both European and indigenous. Women became the means by which power was negotiated, land was claimed, and alliances were formed. But their voices were rarely heard, and their fates were often determined by forces outside their control. The legacy of these early exchanges, while often obscured by the more visible aspects of colonialism, remains a reminder of how women, across cultures, have historically been used as symbols of power and control. Now, let's turn our attention to the long-term effects of these exchanges. The impact of trading women was felt far beyond the immediate moments of these transactions. The ripple effects of these practices, the way they shaped relationships between explorers and indigenous peoples, continued to reverberate through history. The power dynamics created by these exchanges formed the basis for later colonial practices, influencing everything from labor systems to racial hierarchies. The system that began with the trade of goods and people, including women, laid the groundwork for a broader system of exploitation that would persist for centuries. Even today, the legacy of these early exchanges can still be seen in the way women's roles are defined in various cultures around the world. The commodification of women, their use as tools of negotiation, and the lack of agency in these transactions are all themes that echo throughout history and continue to influence the treatment of women in many societies today. As you stand in the heart of a colonial outpost, the weight of history presses down. The echoes of these early trades, the exchanges of women for rum, silk, and land, are still felt today in the lasting legacies of colonialism, power dynamics, and the cultural shifts they triggered. The strange, often unsettling practice of trading women is now just one part of a broader colonial story, but it was one that defined relationships between Europe and the indigenous populations for centuries. As the world continued to change and evolve, these early exchanges would shape the economic, political, and social systems of entire continents, influencing the very foundations of the modern world. But as we examine this piece of history, it's essential to understand how the trade of women was not only about power, but about survival. For the indigenous peoples, these exchanges were often a matter of negotiating for their future. When faced with the overwhelming power of European explorers, who brought with them advanced technology, weapons, and strategies of war, many indigenous groups had little choice but to engage in these transactions. Women were often given as part of larger peace treaties, not just to form alliances, but to ensure the survival of their communities. While the explorers might have viewed these women as bargaining chips for the indigenous people, it was a far more complex issue, one tied to the very existence of their people and their way of life. In many ways, the women involved in these exchanges were caught between two worlds, each with its own set of rules, expectations, and power structures. Imagine the situation from their perspective. One world, European colonialism, sees women as property, objects to be exchanged, used as tools of diplomacy. The other world, often indigenous, views women as vital to the social, spiritual, and political fabric of the community. When European explorers arrived, they introduced a new set of norms, reshaping everything from family structures to gender roles. The indigenous peoples, though, were often not given the opportunity to challenge these new impositions. Their societies, previously self-sustaining and culturally rich, were now forced into a strange, unequal negotiation with foreign powers who did not understand their ways. The indigenous women who were traded weren't just pawns in these political exchanges. They were key players in shaping the future of their communities. The negotiations and alliances built around these trades were not one-sided. Indigenous tribes used these exchanges strategically, offering women not as an act of submission, but as an effort to balance power and protect their people. These women were, in some cases, valued for their roles as intermediaries, helping to broker peace between two cultures that had little common ground. They acted as diplomats, sometimes navigating the delicate and dangerous line between collaboration and resistance. The practice of trading women for goods, alliances, or security wasn't unique to any one part of the world. It spread across the vast expanse of the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, where indigenous peoples, each with their own traditions, were faced with the challenge of engaging with an unfamiliar, often hostile, European presence. But what was startling about this practice was how it became normalized. Over time, it was not seen as an aberration in the course of exploration. It was seen as part of the natural order of colonial conquest. These early explorers often felt justified in their actions, believing that they were bringing civilization to a world they viewed as primitive. In their minds, these exchanges were simply part of a larger process of colonization. But this view of history often oversimplifies the reality. It's important to remember that the women involved in these exchanges were not passive figures. They were part of a larger network of cultural, political, and social negotiation. While many were forced into these trades, others may have had more agency than we assume. Some women were likely used as political leverage, their marriages or relationships viewed as symbolic acts that cemented alliances between cultures. These acts were not just transactional. They were about maintaining relationships, securing peace, and ensuring survival in a rapidly changing world. In some cases, women gained influence by using their roles in these exchanges to their advantage. They brokered deals, influenced decisions, and, in some instances, used their positions to strengthen their communities. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were inherently exploitative or if they were a reflection of the cultural practices of the time. Some suggest that these early trades were simply a byproduct of cultural misunderstandings, where both sides engaged in practices they believed were mutually beneficial. But the larger truth, of course, is that power was not equally distributed in these exchanges. Indigenous women, who had previously been the backbone of their communities, were now being forced into roles they never chose. As much as they might have been seen as valuable in the context of these trades, their voices were often silenced or ignored in the larger narrative of European conquest and exploration. The impacts of these early exchanges were profound and long-lasting. The trade of women during this time created a template for how women would be treated in the colonial era. As colonial empires expanded across the globe, the idea of women as commodities to be traded, married off, or given away in exchange for goods, land, or power became normalized. Women continued to be seen as tools of diplomacy, but also as objects of ownership and control, whether by their husbands, their tribes, or their colonial masters. Yet, even in this harsh reality, the women involved in these exchanges left their mark. Over time, their legacies would be forgotten in the historical record, yet the very existence of these practices speaks to the complexity of colonialism. Their roles, whether voluntary or coerced, were central to the survival of both indigenous cultures and colonial powers. Without them, the world of early exploration may have looked very different. Their stories, often hidden and forgotten, speak to the resilience of women and their ability to navigate, survive, and in some cases, reshape the forces of history. As you reflect on this, imagine the lives of these women, their emotions, their decisions, and the complex world they inhabited. The first explorers may have come seeking gold and spices, but what they truly found were human lives. Lives that would become integral to the larger systems of power they sought to build. These early exchanges, uncomfortable and brutal though they may seem to us today, are part of the tangled history that shaped the world in ways that continue to affect us now. As we look deeper into the legacy of these early exchanges, it's important to recognize the complexities that arose from these transactions, which continue to influence the world today. The exchange of women, as uncomfortable as it might seem in hindsight, was just one part of the larger colonial project. These practices were not only about the personal exchanges between individuals, but were also part of the broader framework of imperialism that sought to control both land and people. When we examine these practices, we uncover uncomfortable truths about the ways in which power, gender, and race were intertwined in the colonial world. As you reflect on these early exchanges, consider how they set the stage for the power structures that would define entire societies. When Europeans traded goods for women, they weren't just gaining allies, they were asserting dominance. The trade of women, whether in marriage or as symbolic gifts, was a clear indicator of how colonial powers sought to control and manipulate the people they encountered. These actions were, in many ways, a reflection of the deeply ingrained belief in European superiority, a mindset that justified the subjugation and commodification of indigenous people and their cultures. The dominance of European colonial powers in the New World was built not just on military might or economic systems, but also on the idea that European norms and values were the correct ones to uphold. The first encounters between explorers and indigenous peoples, while often framed as moments of wonder and discovery, were, in fact, moments of deep power imbalance. European explorers came with the intention of expanding their territories, acquiring wealth, and asserting their control over the lands they discovered. But what they didn't anticipate was the strength and complexity of the societies they encountered. Indigenous peoples weren't helpless or passive. They had their own systems of trade, diplomacy, and power. Yet, the very act of trading women, in many cases without their consent, became an expression of the dominance that European powers sought to assert. Now, think about the long-term effects of these exchanges. The consequences of trading women for goods or alliances were far-reaching. They didn't just impact the women involved, they affected entire societies, shaping the course of history in ways that we're still grappling with today. The women who were part of these exchanges were often left out of the historical narrative, their voices silenced by the dominant cultures that controlled the flow of information. Yet, Their experiences were crucial in understanding the broader impact of colonialism and its lasting legacy. These women, whether they were seen as assets or casualties of the colonial enterprise, played pivotal roles in the shaping of the New World. One of the key aspects of this exchange was the way it influenced the future of colonial relationships. When European explorers and settlers traded women for goods, it wasn't just about short-term gain, it was about creating long-lasting systems of dominance. These exchanges solidified relationships between Europeans and indigenous tribes, but often at the cost of indigenous agency. Indigenous women were often treated as bargaining chips in these diplomatic games, their futures determined by the needs and desires of foreign powers. The power dynamics that were established in these early exchanges set the stage for the ways in which colonial powers would continue to exploit indigenous peoples for centuries. But let's not forget that the indigenous societies weren't just passive victims in this exchange. They were active participants, negotiating with the explorers in ways that sometimes shaped the outcome of these early encounters. Women, despite their treatment as commodities, were often the ones who helped negotiate peace and trade deals. In some cases, women from indigenous tribes married European explorers, forging connections that could be beneficial for their communities. These marriages, while often the result of coercion or pressure, were also a way for indigenous groups to secure safety and resources in an increasingly volatile world. The role of women in these exchanges, whether voluntary or forced, was central to the success of these colonial ventures. But it wasn't just women who were impacted by these early exchanges. The entire social structure of indigenous communities was affected. The introduction of European goods, including firearms, alcohol, and metal tools, shifted the balance of power within indigenous societies. The trade of women, while often seen as a way to secure alliances, also disrupted the traditional roles and structures that had existed within these societies for centuries. The very act of trading women altered the social fabric, sometimes creating divisions within communities and between different tribes. And while the explorers may have viewed these exchanges as a simple matter of trade, the impact on indigenous societies was anything but simple. As we move forward, it's essential to recognize the profound implications of these early encounters and the lasting effects they had on indigenous communities. The exchange of women, though it may seem like a small part of a larger colonial project, is a reflection of the broader systems of exploitation and control that were established during the age of exploration. These early exchanges set the stage for centuries of colonial dominance, during which indigenous peoples were exploited, displaced, and silenced. The trade of women, as unsettling as it may seem, was just one facet of a much larger system of colonial control that would shape the world for generations to come. And as we continue to reflect on this history, it's important to remember that the impact of these exchanges didn't end with the arrival of Europeans in a new world. The legacy of colonialism, of which the trade of women was a key part, continues to influence the world today. The social, political, and economic systems that were established during this time still affect indigenous peoples, women, and marginalized groups across the globe. The echoes of these early exchanges are still felt in the power dynamics that shape our world, and it's up to us to recognize the past in order to understand the present and shape the future. As you continue to reflect on the far-reaching consequences of the early colonial exchanges, it's clear that the practice of trading women was not just a product of its time, but a reflection of the broader structures of power, race, and gender that were established during this period. The impact of these exchanges reverberated through generations, creating lasting inequalities that continue to shape our world today. These early encounters between European explorers and indigenous peoples weren't just about trade. They were about the establishment of new hierarchies, where indigenous peoples, particularly women, were seen as lesser and were treated as commodities in the pursuit of power, wealth, and land. Imagine, for a moment, that you are an indigenous woman living in a community that has long thrived without outside interference. Your role within your community is significant, whether as a leader, a warrior, or a caregiver. You hold a deep knowledge of your land, of the traditions passed down through generations and of the sacred ties that bind your people. Now, suddenly, European explorers arrive, distant strangers, bringing with them strange goods, unfamiliar languages, and powerful weapons. The world as you know it is thrown into chaos, and you find yourself caught in a trade that you didn't ask for. The dynamics of your world are altered, and your life is no longer entirely your own. In these early exchanges, the trading of women was not just a matter of human exchange. It was about reshaping power structures. Women were placed at the center of colonial strategies to establish dominance. From a European perspective, trading women was a practical solution to building alliances with indigenous peoples, securing land, and ensuring the continued success of colonial missions. Yet, these exchanges weren't just about conquest, they were about control. The women involved were not only traded for material goods, but were often seen as symbols of European control, cementing the presence of European powers on foreign lands. As strange and upsetting as it may seem today, this practice was integral to the foundation of colonial empires. But the trade of women was not just about the physical transaction. It was about the long-term impact on indigenous cultures and their social systems. Many indigenous cultures had their own systems of power and kinship, where women played significant roles as leaders, healers, and warriors. By trading women, European explorers were not just taking valuable resources, they were dismantling social structures and imposing new foreign norms. The role of women in these societies was altered forever. In some cases, this led to the displacement of powerful female figures who had previously held key positions of influence. By exchanging women for goods, the very fabric of indigenous society was disrupted, and power was shifted in ways that would have lasting consequences. Even more disconcerting is the fact that these early exchanges weren't isolated events. They were part of a larger trend that would continue throughout the colonial era. As European colonialism spread across the world, the trade of women would persist, though in increasingly more exploitative forms. The very notion of women being used as commodities, as tools for negotiating power, set the stage for centuries of gendered exploitation. The effects of this are still visible today, as gender inequality continues to be a significant global issue. The exploitation of women during the colonial period was just the beginning of a long history of gender violence and inequality that continues to impact women around the world. These early trades also provide an unsettling view into how gender, race, and colonialism intersected. Women were not just victims of the colonial project, they were central to it. Their bodies, their lives, and their roles were used to negotiate power. The colonial powers that dominated the world didn't just conquer land. They conquered lives, controlling women, their families, and their futures. The trade of women is not just a footnote in history. It is a defining feature of the colonial experience, one that shaped the relationships between colonizers and the colonized for centuries. But let's not forget that these women weren't entirely passive in these transactions. While they were often commodified, their actions were not entirely dictated by the explorers or the colonizers. Some women found ways to navigate these exchanges, sometimes using the opportunity to secure better futures for themselves or their families. In some instances, women played crucial roles in negotiations, using their influence and agency to secure peace, protect their communities, or even gain some measure of power. Their stories are often left out of the historical narrative, but they played significant roles in the larger context of colonization. They too were actors in this historical drama, whether as survivors, negotiators, or resistors. In a broader sense, the legacy of the trade of women continues to be felt in the post-colonial world. The power structures that were put in place during the colonial era still affect us today. The colonial exploitation of women, whether through trade, marriage, or labor, helped establish patterns of gender inequality that continue to this day. Women in many post-colonial societies still face the aftereffects of these power dynamics, where their value is often still seen as secondary to men, and their contributions to society are overlooked or undervalued. The trade of women during the colonial period is a reminder of how deeply entrenched these patterns of gendered exploitation can be and how difficult it is to break free from them. However, it is important to remember that despite the systemic oppression they faced, women have always found ways to resist. They resisted through subtle acts of defiance, through their ability to survive, and through their roles as key players in the survival of their communities. While colonialism sought to strip away their agency, women found ways to reclaim it, whether through cultural preservation, resistance movements, or asserting their value in ways that the colonial powers never expected. The history of these women, often forgotten, is crucial to understanding the long-lasting effects of colonialism and the resilience of the human spirit. The trade of women in the early days of exploration and colonization, while deeply troubling, is part of a larger historical narrative that continues to influence us today. It reminds us of the importance of recognizing and addressing the legacy of colonialism and the ways in which gendered violence and exploitation continue to shape our world. But it also calls us to acknowledge the strength, resilience, and agency of women throughout history. Women who fought against the forces that sought to subjugate them, and who, in many cases, paved the way for the future we now have. As we continue through the story of early exploration and the troubling exchanges that took place, we can't ignore the larger context in which these practices were embedded. The legacy of trading women for goods like silk and rum was not just about material wealth. It was about the creation of power structures that shaped the trajectory of colonial history. These early transactions laid the groundwork for the kind of imperial control that spread across the globe in the centuries that followed. From the Americas to Africa and beyond, the establishment of European dominance was not only based on military might and the acquisition of land. It was built on the manipulation of relationships, resources, and, tragically, human lives. But beyond the historical facts, we need to consider the personal impact of these exchanges. Imagine being a woman caught in the wake of this whirlwind of power, politics, and survival. Your life, your body, your role within your community. All of it reduced to a bargaining chip, traded between explorers and tribal leaders in the name of power. For many indigenous women, the arrival of European explorers marked the beginning of a profound shift, one in which their social positions, their identities, and their futures were forever altered by the whims of foreigners who saw them as expendable. The impact of these trades was not just political, it was deeply personal, a wound that many would carry for the rest of their lives. The first colonial empires were built on these fragile, often coercive exchanges. The trade of women wasn't just a reflection of the exploitative nature of colonialism. It was a tool of imperialism designed to weaken and divide indigenous communities. By offering women as part of a trade, European explorers and colonists sought to ensure that they could dominate the societies they encountered. The very existence of these women, traded for rum, silk, or land, was woven into the larger fabric of colonial oppression. It's easy to see these exchanges as small, isolated moments in a vast and complex history, but they were in fact critical to understanding how colonial power was structured and maintained. And what are the explorers themselves? The men who engaged in these exchanges may have seen themselves as agents of civilization, bringing order and knowledge to an untamed world. But the reality of their actions was far more complicated. They saw themselves as participants in a global system of trade that stretched across continents, a system where human lives were seen as commodities, exchangeable for material goods, for strategic alliances, and for power. These men weren't simply interested in land. They wanted to shape the world according to their vision, and in doing so, they became part of a broader narrative of exploitation that would have long-lasting consequences. Women, in this context, were not just part of the land they conquered. They were part of the very economy they sought to establish. As the practice of trading women spread across the globe, it became increasingly normalized. In some cases, women were offered as part of marriage contracts or as symbols of alliance. But in other cases, they were nothing more than bargaining chips, their worth measured by the goods they could fetch. The very idea of women as commodities was reinforced by the colonial mindset, a mindset that saw indigenous cultures as inferior and women as lesser. For the explorers, the idea that they could trade human lives for material wealth was a reflection of the racial and gendered hierarchies that defined their world. To them, these women were just one more piece in the puzzle of empire building, a piece that could be easily exchanged for something more valuable in their eyes. The legacies of these early exchanges are still with us today. The colonial power structures that were established through the trade of goods and human lives continue to shape the way we understand race, power, and gender. The practices of trading women for goods may have been normalized during the colonial period, but their effects have persisted through the centuries. In many post-colonial societies, the residual effects of these practices are still felt, especially in the way women's bodies are viewed and controlled. The commodification of women during the early days of exploration was not just a feature of colonialism. It was a feature of a larger system that sought to control and subjugate entire populations. And this system continues to impact women in the modern world, whether through sex trafficking, gender-based violence, or the ongoing struggle for equal rights. As you think about the legacy of these early trades, it's important to acknowledge the resistance that occurred alongside the exploitation. While women were often the victims of these exchanges, many also found ways to resist. Some used their positions as wives or leaders to influence the course of events, negotiating on behalf of their communities and asserting their own agency. Others fought back directly, using whatever means were available to protect themselves and their people. The resistance of these women is a crucial part of the story, one that highlights the resilience and strength of those who were oppressed. Their stories, though often forgotten in mainstream historical narratives, are an essential part of the larger picture of colonialism and its lasting effects. It's also worth considering the role of women in the colonial powers themselves. While European women weren't directly involved in the early trade of women, they played an indirect role in the shaping of colonial policies and practices. Women in Europe were often seen as the moral backbone of society, expected to uphold family values and maintain social order. This perception of women as moral guardians was used to justify the colonization of other cultures, framing the indigenous peoples as savages in need of European civilization. Women, in this sense, became symbols of European superiority, and their role in the imperial project was to uphold the values that the colonizers believed were superior to those of the indigenous peoples they encountered. The broader implications of these early exchanges extend far beyond the colonial period. The idea of trading women and the normalization of their commodification influenced global systems of trade, exploitation, and inequality that still persist today. The legacies of colonialism, gender inequality, and racial hierarchies continue to affect how women are treated, both in the post-colonial world and in contemporary society. The trade of women during the age of exploration was just the beginning of a long history of gendered exploitation, one that continues to shape the lives of millions of women around the world. As you stand on the edge of this historical moment, looking out at the world shaped by these exchanges, it's important to remember the human cost of these practices. The women traded for silk, rum, or land were not just footnotes in a colonial story. They were real people with their own hopes, dreams, and lives. Their stories have been lost in the broader narrative of exploration and empire building, but their legacy lives on. And as we continue to grapple with the effects of colonialism and the exploitation of women, we must remember that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in the struggles of women today, who continue to fight for equality, justice, and recognition. As you step away from the bustling colonial port, the magnitude of these early exchanges settles in. The world that was reshaped by the age of exploration is vast, complex, and fraught with contradictions. While many of the explorers and colonists were seeking to expand their territories and fortunes, what they often overlooked were the cultures they were encountering and the people who had lived on these lands for centuries. The trade of women, as unsettling as it may seem, was just one example of how these explorers viewed indigenous people not as equals, but as obstacles to be overcome or resources to be exploited. In their eyes, the indigenous populations were there to serve the interests of the European powers, and this dynamic extended not just to material goods, but to human lives. As you look back on these events, one question lingers. How did these early exchanges set the stage for the future of colonial empires and the treatment of indigenous peoples? The trade of women wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger system of exploitation that would shape the course of history. And while the historical record may have buried the stories of these women, their experiences were integral to the very foundations of colonial rule. Their lives, their bodies, became part of the global economy that emerged during this period. And in many ways, they were the silent victims of a system that valued wealth and power over human dignity. The repercussions of these exchanges were felt not only by the women who were traded, but also by the societies they came from. Indigenous communities were forced into a new reality, where their roles were disrupted and their traditions were devalued. The very act of trading women was a disruption of the social fabric, a violent reordering of power that rippled through generations. Families were torn apart, cultural practices were dismantled, and women's roles as leaders, warriors, or caregivers were undermined by forces they could not control. This was the legacy of colonialism, one that continues to haunt indigenous communities today. But it wasn't just the indigenous populations who were affected. The European explorers and settlers were also shaped by these early exchanges. They came to view the world in transactional terms, where human lives were treated as objects to be bartered for goods, land, or influence. The idea that women could be traded as part of a diplomatic or economic deal became normalized, and this mindset would later extend to other forms of exploitation, including slavery and forced labor. The trade of women, while seemingly a minor aspect of the colonial enterprise, was part of a larger system of domination and control that spread across continents. Think about it. What did these early explorers believe they were creating? A new world, perhaps, but one built on inequality and exploitation. The foundations of the modern world were laid on the backs of those who had been colonized, and women, particularly indigenous women, were at the heart of this exploitation. They were pawns in a game played by men who saw them not as individuals, but as tools to further their agendas. And while these women may not have had a voice in the historical record, their experiences, however buried, are essential to understanding the true cost of European colonialism. The colonial system that emerged from these early encounters would go on to define the next few centuries, shaping the world in ways that are still felt today. The legacy of the trade of women and the broader systems of colonial exploitation created a world in which power was unequally distributed, and those who were seen as other, whether because of their race, gender, or culture, were marginalized, dehumanized, and treated as commodities. These early exchanges set the tone for centuries of oppression, and the consequences of these practices are still being addressed by indigenous peoples and marginalized communities around the world. But as much as the history of these early exchanges is marked by exploitation, it's also marked by resistance. The women who were involved in these trades, whether they were coerced or complicit, found ways to navigate their circumstances. Some resisted in subtle ways, using their roles to influence decisions and protect their communities. Others fought back more directly, using their strength and agency to challenge the power structures that sought to control them. And while the stories of these women have often been erased from the historical narrative, their resistance lives on in the struggles of women today who continue to fight for their rights, their voices, and their place in the world. In the modern context, the trade of women during the colonial period serves as a painful reminder of the ways in which gender, race, and power intersect. The legacies of colonialism continue to shape the way we understand gender and race, particularly in the ways women, especially women of color, are treated and valued in societies around the world. The idea that women were once viewed as commodities to be traded is not just a historical fact. It's part of a larger conversation about the value of women's lives and the ongoing fight for gender equality. But the story doesn't end there. The resistance of these early women and the impact of their struggles paved the way for future generations of women who would continue to fight for their rights and their dignity. While the trade of women during the Age of Exploration was a dark chapter in history, it is also a reminder that even in the most oppressive of systems, women found ways to resist, to survive, and to assert their agency. Their stories, though often forgotten, are central to understanding the history of colonialism and its lasting effects. As you stand at the crossroads of this history, remember that the legacy of these early exchanges is still unfolding. The fight for equality, for the recognition of women's rights, and for the dismantling of the power structures that were built on the exploitation of indigenous peoples continues today. The women who were traded for goods, land, or alliances may have been silenced in history, but their strength, their resilience, and their legacy live on. And as we continue to grapple with the impact of colonialism, we must remember that history is not just about what has been lost. It's about what we can reclaim, resist, and rebuild. As you step back from the colonial ports where women were traded like chattel, the larger narrative of these early exchanges begins to crystallize. What we've uncovered is a troubling reality. Early exploration wasn't simply about discovering new lands. It was about exploiting those lands and their people for profit and power. These early exchanges of women were not isolated incidents, nor were they insignificant. They were an integral part of a larger colonial machinery that sought to control, dominate, and redefine the world according to European standards. But the story of these exchanges is not just about the exploration of new worlds. It's also about the exploration of power dynamics that continue to shape global politics today. As the early explorers and colonizers engaged in these complex transactions, they were also laying the groundwork for modern-day practices of exploitation. The concept of commodifying human beings, reducing people, especially women, to their utility, their ability to serve the needs of colonial powers, became a normalized part of the colonial worldview. The most unsettling part of this history is the fact that these practices, though ostensibly in the past, still cast a long shadow. We see the echoes of these early trades in the modern world, particularly in how women are still treated as second-class citizens in many societies. The legacy of colonialism is still present in how power, gender, and race intersect in contemporary politics. Whether it's the exploitation of women in developing countries, or the ongoing struggles of indigenous women fighting for their rights, the story of early exploration and the trade of women still reverberates through the centuries. But it's not just about the legacy of colonialism. It's also about the resilience and resistance of the women involved in these early exchanges. Even as they were being commodified, even as they were traded for silk, rum, and land, these women fought back in ways that are often overlooked by history. They fought to preserve their culture, to retain their agency, and to protect their families. In many cases, women were the backbone of resistance movements, using their knowledge of the land and their position within their communities to act as key players in the struggle for autonomy. And yet, despite the resistance, these early trades left indelible marks on the societies involved. The exploitation of women in these exchanges was part of a broader system of domination that sought to rewrite the social and political order. The practice of trading women normalized the idea that they were mere assets, to be bartered and exchanged, to be used for the benefit of men and empires. This normalization continued long after the age of exploration ended, shaping how women were treated in colonial societies and even in post-colonial nations. What's important to recognize here is how these early transactions were part of a global system of exploitation that reached far beyond the trade of women. The systems of power and control that were established through these exchanges laid the groundwork for much of what we still see today. The commodification of people for profit, the exploitation of natural resources, and the unequal distribution of power and wealth. The early exchanges between explorers and indigenous peoples were not just isolated events. They were the start of a larger project of global domination, one that relied on the exploitation of women and indigenous communities to maintain the power dynamics of the colonial world. But these early trades also reflect a larger truth about human nature, the lengths people will go to in order to maintain power. The exchange of women for goods was a powerful reminder that people can be bought and sold, that human lives can be reduced to their usefulness, and that power, whether political, social, or economic, is often maintained through the dehumanization of others. And though these exchanges may have seemed like normal, everyday occurrences in the colonial world, they were part of a larger system of exploitation that had far-reaching consequences for the societies involved. As you reflect on the legacy of these early exchanges, think about how they shaped the world we live in today. The systems of colonialism and exploitation that were set in motion during the age of exploration continue to affect us, whether we realize it or not. The power dynamics that were established centuries ago still persist in the ways women are treated in many parts of the world, and the ways in which indigenous peoples were exploited for their land, their resources, and their lives still resonate in the struggles of indigenous communities for recognition, justice, and reparations. But this history also offers a powerful reminder of the importance of resistance. The women who were involved in these exchanges, whether they fought back directly or used their positions to secure power for their communities, showed us that even in the most oppressive systems, resistance is possible. Their stories, though often erased or overlooked, are integral to understanding the broader history of colonialism and the fight for human dignity. Their legacy is one of resilience, strength, and survival, a legacy that continues to inspire those who are still fighting for equality, justice, and recognition in the modern world. And as you think about these women, those who were traded for goods and power, those who resisted, and those who shaped the world in ways we may never fully understand, remember that their legacy is still alive today. The struggle for gender equality, the fight for indigenous rights, and the battle against colonial legacies are all part of the same ongoing fight for justice and human dignity. The stories of these early explorers, these women, and the complex web of exchanges that shaped the colonial world may seem far removed from our own time. But the legacies of these practices continue to affect us in ways that are impossible to ignore. As you sit back and reflect on the grand scope of these early colonial exchanges, the ripple effects begin to sink in. The trading of women wasn't an isolated incident. It was a moment in history that illuminated the foundational structures of colonial dominance and the exploitation that underpinned these systems. As unsettling as it may sound, these exchanges became integral to how the colonial world was built, through alliances, through force, and often through the manipulation of gender and power. The colonial powers that emerged from the age of exploration weren't just about controlling land or securing wealth. They were about asserting control over every facet of human existence, from the physical resources of the land to the bodies of those they encountered. These early exchanges of women were part of a larger, insidious system that sought to make human beings into commodities, traded for gold, spices, land, or alliances. The commodification of women, though shocking to us today, was part of a broader pattern of exploitation that laid the groundwork for centuries of colonial rule. The very act of trading human lives for power became a normalized part of colonial expansion. It was a reflection of how colonial powers saw themselves, superior, entitled to the land, the resources, and the people they encountered. Women, in this context, were no more than pieces in the puzzle of empire building, traded at will to ensure that European powers would remain dominant. But the truth of these exchanges goes far beyond the surface. While women were undoubtedly seen as objects of trade, they were also powerful symbols in the colonial game. In many cultures, women were not only the backbone of the community, but also critical players in diplomacy, leadership, and power dynamics. When European explorers arrived on foreign shores, they disrupted these systems by treating women as mere commodities, stripping them of their cultural roles, and reducing their worth to what they could provide in the service of the European powers. The act of trading women in this way was a direct attack on the very structures that held indigenous societies together. As we consider the consequences of these actions, it's clear that the impact of trading women didn't end with the age of exploration. It reverberated across centuries, shaping colonial systems that continue to exploit both indigenous peoples and women. The roles of women in these societies were forever altered, their positions in their communities diminished or erased, as European colonization imposed its own vision of gender roles and power. This was not just an act of domination. It was an act of cultural destruction, an attempt to reshape entire societies by devaluing their most important members. The legacy of these early exchanges continues to haunt us today. The systems of colonialism that were established during the Age of Exploration didn't just disappear after the colonial powers left the shores of the countries they had conquered. The influence of these systems is still felt in the world today, especially in the way women are treated. The dehumanization of women during the colonial period created a precedent for the way women, particularly women of color, have been viewed and treated throughout history. Women were reduced to objects, their value measured by their ability to serve the interests of powerful men. This narrative has been perpetuated for centuries, and the impact of these colonial legacies is still evident in the gendered violence and inequality faced by women around the world today. However, as we examine this history, we also see the emergence of resistance. The women involved in these early exchanges were not simply passive victims. They were active agents of change, fighting for their survival, their families, and their communities. Whether they were coerced or complicit, these women played crucial roles in shaping the course of events. They resisted, survived, and in some cases, fought back against the forces that sought to control them. Their strength and resilience in the face of colonial exploitation are a testament to the enduring power of women's agency, even in the most oppressive of circumstances. In the broader historical context, the colonial era marked a profound shift in the way gender, power, and race were understood. These early exchanges were just the beginning of a global system that would reshape the world, but they were also the first moments in a long history of resistance. Women, particularly indigenous women, became central to the resistance against colonial rule. They fought in their own ways, not just with swords or weapons, but with their knowledge, their resilience, and their ability to navigate the complex power structures that sought to dominate them. While these women may not have been given credit in the historical record, their resistance laid the foundation for future movements for gender equality, social justice, and a recognition of indigenous rights. Today, as we continue to fight for gender equality and social justice, we can look to the early exchanges of women during the Age of Exploration as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. The ways in which women were commodified and exploited during this period may seem like distant echoes of the past, but the legacy of those practices continues to affect us today. The same systems of oppression that were established during the colonial period are still in place, though they have evolved into new forms of exploitation. Women are still fighting for recognition, for equality, and for the right to define their own lives, free from systems that seek to control them. The struggles of these women, both those who were traded and those who resisted, remind us of the power of agency, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Their stories, though often forgotten, are part of a larger narrative of resistance and survival. As we reflect on this history, we are reminded of the importance of acknowledging the past, understanding its impact, and continuing to fight for justice, equality, and recognition. So as you lie down to sleep tonight, think of the women whose stories have been erased from history, the women who were traded, who were used as symbols of power, who were caught in the web of colonial exploitation. And remember that their strength, their resistance, and their legacy live on in the ongoing fight for gender equality and social justice. Their struggles, though often hidden in the shadows of history, are part of a larger narrative of survival, resilience, and hope. As the final chapter of this historical journey begins to unfold, it's important to remember that the story of the early explorers and the trade of women is not just a dark footnote in history. It's a key part of the larger narrative of colonialism, gender, and power. The trade of women was, in many ways, the embodiment of the unequal power dynamics that defined the colonial era. The legacy of this trade, as unsettling as it is, lives on in the power structures and systems of inequality that continue to shape the modern world. These early exchanges, whether viewed as a simple cultural misunderstanding or a deliberate exploitation of indigenous people, had far-reaching consequences that are still felt today. But as we draw the curtain on this story, it's also essential to focus on the resilience of the people involved. The indigenous women whose lives were traded and commodified, and who found ways to resist, survive, and navigate these brutal systems. Their stories, though often erased from the history books, are a testament to the enduring strength and agency of women, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. While colonialism sought to erase their identities and reduce them to objects, their resilience ensured that their stories would never truly disappear. As you sit back and reflect on the broader implications of these exchanges, consider the ways in which colonial practices of power, dominance, and exploitation are still at play in a modern world. The trade of women may have been a product of its time, but the mechanisms of control and oppression that it represents are still alive today. From the global sex trade to the continued dehumanization of women in many parts of the world, the echoes of these early exchanges resonate through the centuries. At the same time, it's important to recognize the incredible strides that have been made since the colonial era. The struggles of indigenous women, and women in general, have not gone unnoticed. From the feminist movements of the 20th and 21st centuries to the rise of indigenous rights movements, women across the world continue to fight for their rights, their autonomy, and their voices to be heard. The resilience of these women, those who live through the brutal realities of colonial trade, and those who continue to fight for justice today, shows us that while the past may have shaped the present, it does not define the future. Think about the legacies of women like these. Their stories, often lost to time, are now being reclaimed by historians, activists, and scholars. They remind us that the fight for equality and recognition has never been easy, and that those who came before us have paved the way for the progress we enjoy today. Their struggles, their victories, and their resistance have shaped the course of history in ways that are only now beginning to be fully understood. Today, the trade of women, while still a serious issue in some parts of the world, has given way to a broader, global conversation about human rights, gender equality, and the fight against exploitation. The legacy of colonialism may have cast a long shadow, but the fight for justice and equality continues to burn brightly. Women everywhere are reclaiming their voices, asserting their rights, and challenging the power structures that have oppressed them for centuries. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, take a moment to think about the women whose stories have been overlooked, whose experiences were used to further colonial agendas. Think about the strength they exhibited, even in the face of such adversity, and remember that their resilience is part of the larger struggle for equality and justice. The past may not be easily forgotten, but we can use its lessons to create a future where these injustices are never repeated. As you reflect on the lessons of this history, remember that you too are a part of this ongoing story. The fight for gender equality, for indigenous rights, for the dignity of women everywhere continues today. And though the road ahead may still be long, the legacy of those who resisted colonial exploitation will always inspire us to keep pushing forward. The exchange of women during the colonial era may have been a brutal chapter in history, but it's also a reminder of the strength, resilience, and power of women, both in the past and in the present. Their stories are far from over, and as long as we continue to learn from their struggles, we will ensure that their voices, their legacies, and their resistance live on for generations to come. As we begin to close the book on this deeply complex history, we recognize the immense complexity of colonial exploration and its impact on the world. While many of the early explorers are remembered as pioneers, brave adventurers, or agents of European civilization, we must not overlook the hidden truths that lie within their journeys. The exchange of women for silk, rum, or land wasn't just a fringe detail. It was embedded within the very system of colonialism. The colonizers didn't just take land or natural resources. They took people, reducing them to tradable assets, and forcing indigenous cultures into a state of dependency and subjugation. The idea of trading women for goods like rum or silk may seem like an oddity from the perspective of modern times, but for the early explorers and colonists, it was a practical strategy for securing their foothold in newly encountered lands. Through these exchanges, they not only gained alliances and valuable resources, but they also gained a psychological edge, an assertion of dominance over people and lands that they had no true claim to. But what they didn't anticipate was the resilience of the indigenous cultures they encountered, the resistance that would form in the wake of these early exploitations. The women who were involved in these exchanges, whether they were traded voluntarily or forced into these transactions, were living through one of the most painful and complex moments in history. They were not merely victims. They were central figures in the power struggles that played out on the world stage. And though their voices have often been silenced in historical narratives, their experiences and agency are essential to understanding the larger picture of colonialism and its impacts. While the early exchanges were based on exploitation, these women's lives were also rich with meaning, filled with complexities, choices, and sacrifices that were shaped by both internal and external forces. As we move through this story, let's think about the ways in which history has treated the women involved in these early exchanges. They've often been erased from the history books or relegated to the margins of larger narratives of exploration and conquest. But their stories are vital. They shed light not only on the human cost of colonialism, but on the resilience and resistance that these women exhibited in the face of overwhelming odds. Their lives were not simply commodities. They were agents of change, influencing the course of history in ways that have yet to be fully appreciated. In considering the legacy of these women, we must also examine the way colonial powers, primarily European, saw themselves as superior to the cultures they encountered. The very act of trading women was part of a larger colonial ideology that viewed indigenous societies as inferior. This mindset was used to justify the exploitation and subjugation of entire peoples. Women, as the bearers of life and the cultural core of many indigenous societies, became prime targets in the colonial system. Their value was diminished and commodified, reducing them to items that could be exchanged for material wealth or political advantage. This degradation was not just physical. It was cultural, spiritual, and emotional. It stripped entire communities of their agency, leaving them vulnerable to the economic and social forces of colonialism. But it's also critical to understand that the legacy of these practices continues to shape the modern world in complex ways. The trade of women during the colonial era set in motion gender dynamics that still persist today. Women, particularly women of color, continue to struggle against systems of exploitation and marginalization. The colonial mindset that viewed women as subjugated bodies continues to manifest in various forms. Whether through modern-day human trafficking, gender violence, or systemic inequalities in many parts of the world. The struggles of these early women were not isolated. They are part of a long and ongoing fight for equality, justice, and the recognition of women's rights. Despite this, the resilience of women, both in the past and in the present, remains a central theme in the story of human survival and resistance. From the very beginning of colonialism, women found ways to resist the forces that sought to control them. They resisted through their strength, through their cultural preservation, and through the ways they navigated the oppressive systems that were imposed upon them. These women fought not just for survival, but for the preservation of their cultures, their identities, and their families. Their resistance, though often unrecorded, was vital in shaping the course of history. The story of the early explorers, their encounters with indigenous people, and the tragic trade of women is more than just a dark chapter in history. It is a reminder that colonialism didn't just strip away land and wealth. It stripped away the humanity of the people it affected. It sought to reduce people to commodities, to deny them the agency they rightfully held. But in the face of this exploitation, indigenous women resisted. They fought to maintain their dignity and preserve their cultures. Their stories are just as much a part of the colonial history as the explorer's quest for power. Today, as we continue to grapple with the legacies of colonialism, we must remember the importance of acknowledging the past and learning from it. The history of the trade of women is not just a lesson in exploitation. It's a lesson in resilience, resistance, and the ongoing fight for justice. The stories of these women, those who were commodified, those who resisted, and those whose voices have been silenced, are the stories that need to be heard. They're the stories that must be passed on, so that the mistakes of the past are not repeated, and so that future generations can build a world that values equality, justice, and respect for all. As you close your eyes tonight and think back on the journey we've taken together, remember the women whose stories have been lost in the shadows of history. Remember their strength, their agency, and their resistance. Their legacies are the foundation of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality, and their fight, though it began in a world defined by colonial exploitation, continues today, carried forward by the women of tomorrow. As we reach the final chapter of this exploration, we come to understand that the history we've just uncovered, this tangled, painful web of trade, gender, power, and survival, is not just a relic of the past. It's a story that continues to shape our world today. The trade of women during the early days of European exploration, though it may seem like an artifact of a bygone era, is deeply connected to the global systems of inequality and exploitation that still exist. The echoes of these colonial exchanges reverberate through history, influencing how we view race, gender, and power even now. The practice of trading women, whether as commodities, peace offerings, or marriage alliances, was not merely an unfortunate chapter in history. It was a cornerstone of the colonial project. The very notion that a person could be treated as a bargaining chip for land, goods, or alliances is something we struggle to fully grasp today. And yet, for many early explorers and settlers, this was simply the way things were. It was a system of power built on the assumption that European life, values, and identities were the only ones worth recognizing. Indigenous peoples were treated as inferior, their customs and cultures disregarded as primitive. Women, in this context, were caught between worlds, seen as pawns in political and economic transactions, yet also playing crucial roles in their communities as the bearers of culture, tradition, and life. The women whose lives were traded in these early colonial exchanges didn't have the luxury of the historical narrative that we now have. Their stories were hidden, erased, or ignored, while the focus was placed on the conquering explorers, their goods, and their ambitions. The role of women, especially indigenous women, was marginalized to the point of invisibility. Yet, their experiences were critical to shaping the world we know today. From the silent negotiations that took place between indigenous leaders and explorers to the complex ways in which women navigated the cultural shifts thrust upon them. These women's actions were instrumental in the survival of their communities and the negotiations of power. As you consider the long-lasting impact of these exchanges, think about how colonialism reshaped not just the lives of the women involved, but the entire global order. Colonial empires created and enforced systems of inequality that span continents, systems that continue to affect how resources, power, and people are valued today. The trade of women, though it may seem like a small aspect of a much larger process, is a powerful symbol of how colonial powers exploited and dehumanized the people they encountered. These early exchanges created a hierarchy of value, a system where the worth of people, especially women, was tied to their ability to serve the interests of colonizers. However, as much as this history is one of exploitation, it is also a history of resistance. The women who were involved in these trades, whether they were directly coerced or found ways to assert their agency, were not just passive victims of colonialism. They resisted in their own ways. Some found ways to navigate the complex power dynamics and form alliances that would protect their communities. Others, though silenced by the colonial narrative, fought back in subtle but important ways, preserving their cultures, maintaining their roles in their societies, and holding on to their sense of identity. The resilience and strength of these women are a testament to the human spirit's ability to survive even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Today, as we look back on this history, we must also look forward. The legacy of colonialism, of the trade of women, and of the imbalances of power that it created is still with us. It has shaped the way we view race, gender, and power today. Women, especially women of color, continue to face the effects of these colonial systems in the form of gender violence, economic disparity, and social inequality. But just as the early women of colonial history resisted, fought, and survived, today's women continue to challenge the systems that seek to oppress them. The struggle for equality and justice is ongoing, and it is up to us to carry the torch passed down by the women who came before us. As you lie down tonight and let the soft hum of the world fade into the background, take a moment to think about these women, these often overlooked figures in the history of exploration and colonialism. Think about their strength, their agency, and their resilience. Their stories may not have been written in the history books, but they are part of the legacy we carry forward today. The struggle for equality, for recognition, and for justice is a struggle that transcends time. It is a fight that continues to this day, and just as the women of the past fought for their rights and their dignity, so too must we. The colonial exchanges we've explored, though often painful to think about, are part of the larger human story. They remind us of the ways in which power has been negotiated, resisted, and challenged throughout history. And as we move into the future, we must continue to learn from the past, to honor the resistance and resilience of those who came before us, and to build a world where all people, regardless of gender or background, are valued equally. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the women whose stories have been lost to time, and remember the power they held, even in the face of immense hardship. Their legacy is part of who we are, and their fight for justice continues, in ways both small and large, in every part of the world. It's a legacy that's not just for the past. It's for the future, and it's up to all of us to ensure that it lives on.